Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
Before we do our normal intro and whatnot, we do want to talk about Bronny James. He suffered a cardiac arrest situation while at practice for USC, University of Southern California. So prayers from the Off Ball Takes family, the entire channel, everyone behind the scenes, all that stuff. For the entire James family as they're going through this extremely difficult time. This is something that you never want to see. And we will continue to keep you guys updated 100% on the situation as we know more. We don't want to speculate or anything, get ahead of the doctors or anything like that. And I believe the report came out, I think today or yesterday, whatever, that he has been released from the ICU, so he's not in critical condition anymore. So I believe he's still probably at the hospital, but nonetheless, that doesn't change the gravity of the situation for any of us. Prayers from us once again, and we hope that you keep him in your prayers as well, and that he gets better with a swiftness.
Yeah, absolutely. We support, all of the family members and everyone, because obviously at this time they want the privacy to make sure,
Right.
everything's going on and everything's okay with him. Like you mentioned, as of today, it's been reported by Shams that he has been discharged from the hospital. So that's a good sign, that
Yeah.
he should be, getting better, and he's able to get back home, and continue to recover and do good. So that's good. So hopefully that continues to work out
Right.
for the best, because obviously it's always a difficult time, for anybody,
Yeah.
in that
It can be
situation.
scary. We
Yeah,
just want to,
exactly.
keep everybody in our prayers and hope for his well being and safety.
Yeah. So now, we're going to get into our next team, of the off season. Just kind of like, just obviously as we did before, similar format, right? Talking how we got here, what we have now, and where we think they're going to be going this season. And that next team is the Sacramento Kings. So, before we get into this, obviously, as we say, in every video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also don't forget to follow our socials at the OBT Podcast, on Instagram as well as Twitter or X or whatever it's called these
Yeah.
days.
Whatever you
Um,
want to go by.
yeah, so now we're going into the Sacramento Kings. So obviously this was a team that was kind of the surprise Cinderella story of last year. Obviously they had spent what was it, 16, 17 years without playoff basketball, right? Sacramento, one of the biggest fan bases, or at the very least one of the coolest, most interesting, one of the proudest
Passionate.
fan bases of the, yeah, most passionate. I think that's probably the best word to
Yeah.
use. Um, so obviously, like, yeah, they've had a lot of years of fertility, right? They've had some really good players, in their mix over time, right? Tyreek Evans, DeMarcus Cousins. A lot of these guys, worked for a while, and then for whatever reason, it just, continued to not work out.
Right.
Obviously they had the Kings teams of the early 2000s, right? With Chris Webber, Bibby,
Jason
Divock,
Williams.
yeah, Jason Williams, I think before that. So,
Yeah.
um, but last year, right? Everything worked for them, right? They had kind of, made a better habit of making some better moves and decisions.
Mm-hmm.
The season before, right? They made that kind of polarizing ish trade that ended up working out for both sides, right? Where they traded, Domantas Sabonis, or traded for Domantas Sabonis by
Mm-hmm.
sending away Tyrese Halliburton.
Yep.
Both guys are really good, right? It ended up, in my opinion, working out for both teams.
Absolutely.
Um, right, and the Kings obviously are on this path now where they're trying to, be a competitive team, right? They're not trying to be just like a rebuilding team. They're trying to win games, and be a good team, right? Because again, when you go almost 20 years without a title, or not without a title, without a playoff appearance, all you just want is to be good. And they were really good last year, right? They were third in the Western Conference, 48 and 34, right? They got the new coach Mike Brown, right, who had coached before around the league, right? He did a really good job. Obviously, offensively, they were the best team in the regular season. But their issues, defensively, not great. I believe bottom five defensive team for most of the season. It got a little better in the playoffs,
Their
right? They
offense
took,
was carrying them, man. It was ridiculous to
yeah,
watch, really.
right. Yeah, they took the Warriors, to 7 games. But they did get, they did lose in an upset. I mean, they were not projected to win the series, right? But they were the higher seed.
Yeah. They were the
Lost
second
to the,
seed.
yeah, I think they were third.
Oh, third. Sorry. Yeah. Excuse me. Tired.
Yeah, you're good. Lost to the at the time defending champions. No shame in that. Led by De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, right? They're two All NBA players from last year, right? Really good players. With another group of core guys around them, right? Keegan Murray, who was a rookie last year, was awesome for them. Combined with some other younger guys like Malik Monk. and others like that. In addition, some vets like Harrison Barnes. So this offseason, they kind of opted to really just go for more continuity, right? Most of the guys from last year's team were brought back. The main guys that are coming out are some of the role guys, right? Guys like, say, Rashawn Holmes, who wasn't really part of the team, for most of last year, right? He was a guy that had started for the Kings, a few seasons ago, right? And, just over time, right? His minutes were gone, right? He wasn't going to start over Sabonis,
Right.
because Sabonis is the better player. But, um, again, most of the guys from last year's team are back, right? They did make a few minor moves, right? Obviously, they did re-sign Harrison Barnes. Like I said, they renegotiated and re-signed, I think, Sabonis to an extension. They made a trade to bring in Chris Duarte, right, over from Indiana. And then after that, right, I believe they also signed Nerlens Noel, right, to be like a third stringish, I guess, sort of backup center.
Yeah.
But like I said, outside of that, um, most of the guys are relatively, again, are coming back. I think
Yeah.
they
It's
also
a
signed
similar
another
team.
guy. Yeah, I think they also signed another guy over from the EuroLeague,
Hmm.
Sasha.
Sasha Vezenkov, I
Yeah,
think Vezenkov.
I think, yeah, but I'm not as familiar
He's like a
with his
six
game.
nine
Apparently,
forward.
yeah, apparently he's one of the top guys, and coming over from Europe. So we'll see how he translates. Um, but obviously, right, like I mentioned, it's all about the continuity, and the growth. They're probably hoping from some internal development, from some of those other guys, right? Because again, like we look at their starting roster, or excuse me, starting five, right? Again, it's gonna probably be the same as last year, right? You got De'Aaron Fox, Kevin Herter, Keegan Murray, Harrison Barnes, Domantas Sabonis, right? That's the same starting five as last year, and I think that's probably going to be the same thing, right?
Right.
You look at the bench, right? Davion Mitchell, right, who was kind of like their backup defensive 3-and-D point guard.
Hmm.
Um, right, Malik Monk, kind of that big time scorer off the bench, right? I'd imagine Duarte will probably play some, since he's supposed to be a 3-and-D-ish guy.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I think he's only been in the league for what 3 seasons, but he's
3, I think.
already what
26.
26.
Yeah, I think he came in as like what, a senior or something.
Yeah,
Can't
exactly.
remember, but he
Yeah,
went to
yeah,
Oregon. But he's really good. I think
exactly.
that's a great addition for them.
Yeah, exactly. He was playing in Indiana, but his playing time kind of dwindled after a while because they had other guys that were a little bit better, and
Right.
also like I think he had some injuries as well. So
Yes.
hopefully he can turn that around in Sacramento because again they need defense, and they need it bad because they were one of the worst in the league
Yeah.
last year in the regular season. Like I said, it got better in the playoffs, but you need a little more than that, come playoff time. Because again, some of the things that they were doing scheme wise made sense. They just didn't have the personnel for it. And some of it they're not going to have, right? Because Sabonis, doesn't give you a super high ceiling as a defensive big because that's not his game, right? He's not the worst defensive big man in the world, right? But he's not great. Um, and then offensively, right? He's not like a great outside shooter. I think his outside shooting was probably affected somewhat because I think he was playing with that hand injury, pretty much for most of the season.
Hmm.
So if assuming that improves, right? Maybe his shooting will get back, to being a little bit better, right? But we'll have to see. Um, and then, getting into more of the bench guys, right? As we mentioned, the guy coming over from the EuroLeague, right? I'd imagine because they gave him, 6.5 million, I think, for this season, right? He's probably going to play at least somewhat. He'll get
A
an
decent amount.
opportunity, I would think.
That's a lot more
Um,
than some of their other rotational guys like Len and other guys that we'll talk about.
right,
So he's
exactly.
got to play.
Um, yeah, Kessler Edwards, I think, came over from Brooklyn, right? Again, probably not going to get a whole lot of playing
No.
time. I would imagine, because they have other guys.
Yeah.
And then after that, right, Trey Lyles, right? That's a guy that was a big part of their roster, right? Because he could kind of be put out there, when they're going small, and he can space the floor, and he can do some things. He's a pretty solid player, right? I believe he was out of Kentucky. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I think he was a lottery pick by Utah, so he didn't really pan out as like a star, but he's been a
Yeah.
decent, utility
He's
guy.
basically a
And
6'9" stretch four, stretch five, whatever.
yeah, exactly. And then after that, with I believe, then you also look at I think with their big situation right after Sabonis, it's Alex Len and Nerlens Noel, right? So again, we saw in the playoffs, right? Alex Len played sometimes for for the Kings in that Warriors series, and there were a couple of times when he was out there where he made somewhat of an impact just because he was a big body, that could roll, and because he
Right.
was so tall, he could block some shots. Um, Nerlens Noel will give you a little bit of a different look, right? Because he's not as big as Len, right? But A little bit more athletic. But he hasn't really been that significant of a player in a little bit. Um, so, I do kind of wonder what type of impact he really brings, if any. I mean, either way, he's a backup center, right? Either backup or third string, because both of those guys are minimum contract centers. So you don't
Absolutely.
really need a ton. Yeah, just ideally, you'd like, you know, somebody who can bring you something defensively that Sabonis can't and that Lyles can't really do as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I
yeah,
mean,
exactly. So,
it's a good deal. I think this roster is pretty solid in itself, and there's a lot of backup guys I think that have really good potential, especially for the playoffs, because a lot of them are vets. So you
yeah.
can't really be mad at this roster, especially if they're pretty much running it back and they just added some other pieces.
Right. Another guy, Colby Jones, right? That's the guy I believe that they drafted
Yep.
out of Xavier. Second round pick, right? Again, probably not gonna do, much for them just because again, they already have a decent amount of other guys that they're probably already trust more.
hmm
Um, but it'll be interesting to see, if he gets any time. I mean, it was a 4-year deal
I think he
with the
will get
Kings.
some time.
Yeah, 4 years, I believe 8-ish million, right? So that's, pretty solid for a second round pick. Um, But again, like they're I think they're set up, pretty well. Obviously they didn't make the splash that I think some people were thinking that they could make in free agency, because they did create the ability to have some cap. But again, like when they signed Barnes to that extension, that made me think, okay, they probably already know that they're not really getting anybody.
Right.
So I don't think I can really fault them, for opting into, this, running it back. And either way, like they're gonna have some flexibility potentially, down the line. If there's somebody on this roster that they may not mind moving, because again, like I believe they still have picks, and they do have, some players that some people would want. So there's some flexibility potentially for, some type of deal to be made. But either way, I do think that the roster that they have right now is solid. Um, Obviously we know the strengths of the roster, right? You know, Shooting obviously because they were one of the best in the league last year. Offense, right? That's what it's geared towards. Um, they do have some vets, like I mentioned, Harrison Barnes. That's a valuable guy, even if his production can be up and down. Right? He has been on, championship teams.
hmm
Um, but again, the weaknesses are still largely the same to me, right? Defensively, I think. I mean, I just don't. I mean, they didn't really do much to correct that.
No.
Again, we'll see with the bigs, but to me, like the weaknesses are still basically the same. It's still a relatively still kind of a young team. Um, but either way, like I said, I don't mind them running it back. But I feel like this is a team that could potentially. I don't want to. I don't know if regress is the right word, but I feel like they could potentially just take a step back, just because I feel like that there are other teams that got better and they didn't necessarily get, much better. Unless again, there's some crazy internal improvement. Right, Keegan Murray looked really good in the California Classic Summer League. Right,
Yes,
so
he
if he's
did.
kind of exactly, so if he takes a leap forward and really becomes like a two-way star-ish level player or somewhere close to that, in his second year, which again, that's a big ask. But if he does take a big step forward, then that's going to raise the ceiling somewhat. Just because again, he's the guy that brings a lot of value with that size, and that shooting ability. And again, like he looked very comfortable for the most part, as a rookie. Right? Again, a rookie starting for a playoff team. And even in the playoffs, it started off pretty rough, but he got much better as that series went along. Which is good because again, you want to see growth from those young guys. He is a little bit older, I suppose, than some of these other than some of the other rookies. I think he was like 22. Now he's going to be, I guess, 23 going into the year,
Yeah.
right? But again, regular season wise, 12 points, 4.5 boards, steal and a block, half a block, right? In the playoffs, a little bit worse, but again, smaller sample size, and he was better over the last few games of that series, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Absolutely. And like the thing is, I think I'm not gonna say he was a steal, but definitely a great pickup because I don't think they would have gotten as far as they did, without him. And overall, I was really impressed with their season in general last season because I don't think
Yeah,
anybody predicted them to be the number 3 seed. Um, Overall, I think the roster is very solid. And like you said, they definitely could have done more, but you honestly can't blame them for running it back considering the season that they had. It was almost magical. And then they brought in Mike Brown as the head coach, and he really turned this organization around and got them
yeah.
back into the playoffs. So it's been really phenomenal to watch. I think it's one of the best storylines, organization wise, to see them come back to being a contender somewhat.
Yeah, Mike Brown winning Coach of the Year. Like he said, he definitely did a really good job in turning that team around. And he's been around as a head coach, and he did bring some things to the table in Sacramento that I thought were better than what he had in his previous stops. He's definitely grown, I think, in
And they
some ways
won
as a
this
head coach.
division, you know? They won
Yeah,
this division, which is crazy.
exactly. It's just, obviously because they didn't make big splashes, it's more about, what are we gonna get from, some of the main guys on the team, like say De'Aaron Fox, right? Had a career year last year, not just in terms of the numbers, but also just in terms of, winning, right? He averaged 25 and 6. Um, you know, 50, over 50% from the field, not great from three. But still, right? Then you go into the playoffs, right? 27 a game, 8 assists, 2 steals, half a block. Again, didn't shoot as well, but as we
Super
know, down the
clutch,
stretch of
though.
that series, yeah, down the stretch of that series, I believe he fractured or
It
or
was a
whatever he
finger.
did, yeah, to his finger in his shooting hand, I think.
Yep.
Um, yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the interesting thing is will he take another step forward? Because again, he's still relatively young. He's 25, right? So in theory, he hasn't hit his peak yet. Like you mentioned, he was, I believe, the clutchest player in the NBA last year. He won the first, clutch player of the season award, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
and you got to
So
keep in mind he was in that draft with I believe Lonzo Ball, so
yeah,
you just got to put that into perspective of how young this guy really is, and I think he has a lot of room to grow even better. I think if he can figure out the jump shot, then he's probably going to be one of the more lethal point guards in the West. Honestly, I think it's up for grabs in terms of that lethality aspect of his game. So I'm curious to see, if he does take that step forward because we know what he is. We know he's athletic. We know he's arguably one of the faster players in the league, if not the fastest. He's okay at defense. More of like a I guess like ball hawk kind of guy, like where it's like, he can get the steals and blocks, but some people don't classify that as defense. Sometimes he does get beat by his defenders, but
right.
nonetheless, he's a tempo pusher and he knows how to control the game. And, a guy like that with a jump shot would be very dangerous. So I'm curious to see, if his game takes another leap forward. So I'm the
Yeah.
same boat as you with that.
Yeah. Because again, like I said, since it's a similar roster, it's kind of like, what are we getting out of some of these other guys,
Right.
right? Kevin Herter, that's another guy, to think about because in the regular season, right, he, basically had a career year, right? The Hawks essentially gave him up, for nothing,
Yeah.
pretty much to dump salary. He averaged 15 a game, 3 assists, 3 rebounds, right? 40% from three,
It's
48 and a
crazy,
half
man.
from the field, right? And then you go to the playoffs. And it was a big drop off, right? 9 points, a little over 4 rebounds, but then you look at the shooting 35 from the field, 21% from three, right? That's kind of one of those guys where if he had played, anything close to what he was doing, um, you know, in the regular season, right, that may have been enough to lift them over Golden State potentially, just because in some of those, games that they lost, I mean, he was really awful. I mean, the defense at times was okay, right? But again, the offense, I mean, just, 30 something percent from the field, that's just not good enough, particularly, again, he's out there primarily to score. He's not really out there, to defend. Obviously, he's got decent size at 6'7".
Right.
Um, but still, you need a better, postseason, performance than that. Just because, that's again from your starting two guard, that's not good enough. So, he's the guy that I think, assuming he's, continues to stay on the team, which I don't see a reason why he wouldn't,
Yeah.
unless he's involved in some type of big trade. That's another guy that you're looking for, to have a better performance. Because again, another guy that's still relatively young. He's 24. He's going to be 25 going into the season. So, um, you know, hopefully, he can figure some of that stuff out. Because I remember, in Atlanta, I believe it was his rookie year, right, where he had, that crazy game 7 to eliminate Philly.
Yeah.
Where he played really well. I think he was one of their leading scorers, if I'm not
Yep.
mistaken. So
Knockdown shooter, man. But,
yeah,
it's got to be a little bit more consistent for sure, especially when it comes to the playoffs. Because at times in the playoffs, they were pretty much leaving him wide open. And that's not something you really want to see, from Kevin
right,
Herter, who's
exactly,
somebody who has a reputation of being that knockdown shooter. I hope his career doesn't take, like, the Joe Harris kind of path, because,
right,
I mean, we know that he can do a little bit more, obviously, than just shoot. He can get to the rack a
yeah,
little bit, make some plays. So I'm curious to see,
right,
what he can do. But I feel like the potential is there for sure, and that's
yeah.
definitely a guy to keep your eye on.
Right. I just checked in the game 7 against the Sixers, 27 points, 7 rebounds, 3 assists and a steal. I mean, 2 of 4 from three, 10 of 18 from the field. And, that was in a high pressure game 7 against
Exactly.
the one seeded Sixers. That was the year the Hawks, made that, unexpected run to the conference finals. So,
Yeah.
if he can kind of tap into, that. And again, in fairness, that happens to guys sometimes in the playoffs, right? Even say like Clay Thompson, right? He was, completely cold, in that Lakers series, for most of the playoffs, but especially in that Lakers series, he
It
could
was
not hit
really
a
bad.
shot. Yeah, down the stretch. And, sometimes that can kind of swing, playoff series because, again, like I mentioned, with Kevin Herter, if he plays, again, closer to what he was giving you in the regular season, they may have beaten, Golden State. Maybe if Clay gives you some better performances, maybe that swings the Lakers series. You just never know. And that does happen, especially for guys who are, offensively, more just predicated towards being, jump shooters, right? Neither of those guys, they can get to the basket, right? But that's not, their go-to, offensive style, right?
Right.
Those guys are more comfortable, being jump shooters. So, but again, sometimes that can be mitigated a little bit, right? Again, if you get, even more growth from some of those other guys, because again, if De'Aaron Fox goes up another level, if Sabonis has, a better playoff performance, um, or if somebody else, right, just kind of goes crazy and just swings, one of these series, that's kind of what you have to look at. Because again, they don't have like a ton of star power, but they do have some good players, um, in my opinion. Because again,
Yeah.
like, we talked about the strengths of the roster. It's clearly an offensive oriented roster. Not much going defensively. Like I said, they brought in Duarte, but outside of that,
It's
you're
not a
kind of
game
just
changer
hoping.
though.
Yeah, exactly. You're kind of hoping that some of these other guys, just grow. Because, like you said, Duarte probably is not going to be, a guy that completely swings your, playoff odds. But
Yeah.
yeah, we'll just have to see. So I guess, kind of similar to, what we had mentioned for these previous teams, what do you feel like the ceiling, the expectation for this team should be? Because I'm thinking, um, you know, if all goes well, they could probably make it, to the second round. Or maybe if they get really lucky at conference finals, but that's
Okay.
probably best case scenario.
Yeah.
Um, I'm thinking ideally, right, maybe second round, kind of, but I think it's heavily dependent on who they match up against because, of that defense, because on the perimeter, their defense is fine. But
It's that
it's on the
interior
interior.
because they
Yeah,
just
where,
they just pretty much paint mash Sabonis, and it's like we even
right.
talked about that in the playoffs. They're like they need to find
Yeah,
the answer to that, and they never really did. So I'm curious if they found it now, and I don't think they really have. I mean, they brought in some
right.
centers like Nerlens Noel, but how much is that really going to impact your rim protection?
Exactly. Yeah, because
Especially if
that's
his
how I
minutes
feel.
are, distributed between him and Sabonis. I mean, I think Sabonis is going to take majority of those minutes. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
exactly. So that's kind of the thing. I think it's going to be heavily dependent on who they match up against because I think there are some teams that they could match up against better than others.
Yeah.
Teams that don't really attack the basket like that, that are more jump shooting teams.
Right.
Those are probably the type of teams that they can probably, do fine against. Right. But if they go against a team that, really is okay with taking it to them, inside, that's going to be the type of team I think they struggle against, right? Because again, even Golden State, who you don't really think of as a team that attacks the rim like that, they were able to do that a lot against the Kings. And again, there are other teams that attack the basket even more, right? Teams like say LA, with the Lakers, right? You could even factor in I guess a team like a Memphis, right?
Hmm.
They say like when Ja's healthy, right? He can attack the basket. And they have some other big guys as well. So I think it's kind of dependent on who they face.
Sure.
Um, so like I said, that's how I feel about it. Second round is probably the ceiling.
Right.
Of course, you always have to factor in, injury luck and things like that for any team, right? They were a team that, up until that playoff injury with Fox, right? They were one of the, I think, the healthiest team in the league all year. If I'm not mistaken. So I mean,
Yeah.
because again, you look at the roster, from last year, and you're looking at all the games that they played, right? I'm looking at the roster, right? 79 for Sabonis, 73 for De'Aaron Fox, 82 for Barnes, 78 for Keegan Murray, 75 for Kevin Herter, right? Those are your starters. So all your starters played, you know, 70 plus games, and even other guys off the bench like Malik Monk, 77 games, Davion Mitchell, 80 games, Trey Lyles, 74. Um, is that likely to happen again? Maybe,
I don't
but
know.
probably not. And that's, hopefully they do play, as many games as they can. Nobody wants to see anybody get hurt.
Right.
Um, but obviously if you have your guys, for basically 70 plus games, your best players and you have decent talent, right? You're going to win, more games more often than not. So I feel like again, I think they can get to the second round. like I said, I just think it's dependent on who they play. But much past that, I think they'd have to be really, really lucky. And again, everybody needs luck to win a title, but some teams need more luck than others. But
Yeah,
I don't think right now a title is what their goal is, necessarily at the
they just
moment. I
want to
think
be
they're just
relevant.
happy. Yeah, I think they're happy to be relevant and be a competitive team, right? Because
Sure.
again, you don't want to make it to the playoffs and then get swept.
Right.
Um, you want to see some progress. So I think they could make the second round, but much past that, I think there's too many teams that I think are better than them. For them to get much further than that.
Yeah.
Again, unless they have some luck go their way, which again, you never know, could happen.
And it's like for me, it's the same thing pretty much. Ideally speaking, um, I think the second round is probably their max. I think because you got to factor in who are the big boys in the West now.
Yeah.
It's pretty much the same as last year, but a lot of those teams have gotten better. Pretty much outside of like Denver, I think everybody's pretty much improved that was in the playoffs. You got the Lakers, you got the Clippers, I guess. Memphis as
Suns,
well, Suns,
Suns,
obviously, yeah.
Golden
So
State.
exactly. So everybody's pretty much, made some additions to the point where they've gotten a lot better. And I'm just not sure how well this Sacramento team is going to compete against those guys, especially when it comes to playoff time. But if they have another magical run, then I guess we can't really say it's magic anymore because that's just their squad. So
Right.
that's kind of how I'm looking at it. But definitely, I think second round is probably their maximum peak. And then what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, so like seeding wise, I don't think they'll probably get the third seed again. I think that's
So
I don't think
yeah.
I think that's out of the question. I'd see them more around the 5 or 6 range maybe, but that's just cuz everybody else got better than them, but we have to see them play, I think, but these are obviously predictions for sure. But I'm predicting them to be around that 6 range.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like they could still be, a good team, but just
Lower.
because there's more good teams, it may be a little bit harder for them to be, that third seed. But it will be interesting. Again, as we mentioned, like with all the teams that have made improvements, what the records are, for a lot of these teams, going into next year, right? Because again, once you got past, the third seed or so. I think all of them were really close, right? Because we had that stretch where we were kind of trying to figure out, who was going to be 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
Because really was down to the wire,
It
and
was a
there's
cluster,
potential
man.
for that. Yeah, exactly, and there's potential for that to happen, again this year, only because, like you mentioned, a lot of these teams, have continued to get better. That's kind of how you have to look at it. I guess when we look at the Kings, over under, again they're kind of projected around 45 and a half. So I mean, I think that's three less games than they won this year. I think they won 48 this year. So I mean,
Yeah.
that is probably fine. I mean, because again, they're probably going to be somewhere similar,
Yeah.
but probably a little bit worse, right?
The
I don't think
problem
they'll get.
No, sorry, go
Mhm.
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the thing. They could probably get to. They're definitely going to be above 500, obviously. But I don't think they'll be at 50 wins because I just think there's going to be too many good teams, and I don't think they're the best of those good teams. To get to 50 wins. I mean, they maybe they could, but I don't really see too much of a scenario where they win more games than last year.
Right.
Unless like I mentioned, with the roster, there's some big time improvement from some of the guys that are already on the team.
Yeah, and it's like for me, I think obviously they're gonna win less games, which obviously means they're gonna lose more. And then obviously you have the other teams that got better, like I said, so that automatically makes them, more likely to have a lower seed. And like you said, it's not that they're a horrible team or a bad team. It's just everybody got better around them. Um, and that's just the harsh reality that we're looking at. And I'm rooting for them. I want to see them, not win a title necessarily, but I want to see them be good and
Yeah,
stay relevant because that's what they need to do. And championships don't happen overnight. This is probably like step one or maybe like pre-planning. This is like step one in your itinerary. You want to see yourself be able to get to the playoffs, and they did that. So now they need to build over the years and get better, and continue to build through the draft, trade, whatever. And the problem is, they have such a great fan base, but they're such a small market team. But I think we're in for another interesting cluster series probably down the line where it's like there's a bunch of teams that are fighting for those 4, 5, 6, 7 slots, and then we're just watching the battle happen at the end of the regular season. So I'm curious to see where they land, but I think it's probably going to be towards the bottom because there's also some sleeper teams lower down the line as well in the West. So I'm very curious to
right.
see how they do.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because you can't, you also can't forget, and obviously we'll get to these teams, as we, go through, the different divisions and conferences, right? But
Hmm.
there's other teams, right? Say like, like a New Orleans, if you have guys that are healthy, Dallas, did they make enough moves to where they
Right.
should be, better than last year? That's kind of, and again, again, I keep beating this, over and over and over again, right? But again, like in terms of getting out of the West, right? You're gonna have to beat at least two of those top four teams, right? Again, two out of those four teams, which would include, like Denver, LA, Golden State, Phoenix, right? Like probably two of those four teams you're going to have to beat in order to get, out of the Western Conference. And I just don't think the Kings can do that. But I do think they can get to the second round. Like I said,
Yeah.
it's dependent on who they play, and what the seeding is, which normally, you would say that about a lot of teams, right? But, some teams like they can match up well against a lot of teams, but I think the Kings are a little bit more matchup specific than some of the top teams. Not that the other teams don't have teams that they, wouldn't do as well against, but again with the Kings because they're, defensively not as good as some of those other teams, right? Because even Denver during the regular season, I think they were 15th. So they had the potential to improve, and get better, right? But with the Kings, they were 25th, and like I said, they were better in the playoffs, but you still saw a lot of those problems defensively, and I don't, like I said, I don't feel like they've done enough, to really make that a non-issue.
Yeah.
Unless they, unless there is possibly, a situation where maybe they can swing a trade for somebody at the deadline. I don't know who that would be. But it is because their name, had been in some of those rumors, right? It wasn't going to happen, right? But I think, it was rumored that Bradley Beal, the Kings was a team that he would have been okay waiving his no trade clause for, for whatever reason.
Right.
Maybe they somehow make some type of Siakam deal, down the line. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not, don't aggregate this or anything. But there is the potential for that, and that would obviously change the ceiling of their team.
Absolutely.
But
That would make
obviously,
them 10 times better, I think.
right, exactly. But for now, we can only go off of as they're constructed.
They need that third
And
star,
again,
and I think what they're banking on, honestly, is that Keegan Murray takes that leap forward. So I think that's why we saw him playing there. He knows that we know that he wants to get better, and that's clearly the narrative that they're trying to spin on us. And I think it's a believable one, especially since I think they're a third piece away from being a long time playoff team. You know what I mean? Like you said, like if
right.
some guy like Siakam came, and I thought we both thought actually that Kuzma was probably going to sign with Sacramento, but then, like you said,
Yeah.
once Harrison Barnes signed, it was pretty much over, and we were like, okay, so they're probably not going to get anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of just how you have to look at it, because again, like I said, we can only really look at it how it's constructed. But I do think there's, a pathway for, if they can swing a trade for somebody, because they're not going to get somebody in free agency, because, like you mentioned, it's a small market team. Those type of teams don't usually get, free agents to come there, right? And so,
Mm-mm.
and I mean, this was not really a year, where you had a lot of big time free agents, right? Most of them were in, that lower tier, as we mentioned, before we talked about free agency.
Yep.
Um, but that's kind of how we look at it, from this perspective. So, like I said, I like the team. They were a really good story last year. Obviously, they were, kind of a running gag, for, a while just because, they just had so many years of just, either bad decision making, um, or just bad teams. So, but, now it seems like they've kind of gotten that under control. There's a lot more stability now, because even the Keegan Murray pick was a pick that was kind of like, some people were wondering, like, what are you guys doing?
Drafted
Because
the
I think
most
it was
ready
Jake.
guy. Yeah, they
Yeah, because it was
drafted the
Jake.
most ready person though. That's what they did.
Yeah, because at the time, I think Jaden Ivey was the guy on the board that everybody was like, "This is the best guy." But the Kings opted, like you said, to go for the guy, who was the best fit. Who, like you said, was also ready. And he came out of the gates and he was ready. Um, again, maybe not as high of a ceiling as a guy like Ivy, but I think he'll still be a really good player because again, he already showed flashes of, a really solid all around versatile game, and
Yes.
he can get better. Again, obviously, the 4 year, 3 4 year college guys usually have higher floors but lower ceilings. But like you said, if he does take that leap forward, and it's possible because again, he's a tall, skilled forward, who can shoot, who's a decent athlete, and those type of guys you don't always just get access to. So if you can have a guy like that on your team, that's really valuable.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I guess to kind of wrap up, our Kings discussion, what grade, do you think you would probably give the Kings? for this offseason. Because, our first few teams, we kind of gave them pretty solid grades. I think we gave, the Suns, the Warriors, and the Lakers all, somewhere around a B or better. But the Kings, I don't
I'm gonna
know
be
if I can
harsh.
really,
I'm gonna be
yeah,
harsh.
similar grade. I feel like it might have to be like a C
Mm-hmm.
ish, just because, again, like, they did they did a decent job of, bringing everybody back, that
Right.
was a part of their roster, a main part of their roster, and swapping a couple guys out. But at the same time, I don't really feel like that they really, got better, and I don't really feel like they could that they fixed or, potentially plugged some of the holes that are in the roster. So, like I said, I feel like I'm probably leaning towards a C. That doesn't mean that I think that they had a bad
Right.
offseason.
It's
But,
average.
like I said, yeah, just average. Yeah, like you said, average. Because it could have gone a lot worse, right? They could have lost Harrison Barnes, to somebody else, and then they don't replace him really with anybody, other than like, mid-tier guys, that they have to overpay. Or maybe, something else happens. Maybe they make a bad trade. But
Yeah.
like I said, I'd say probably a relatively average offseason, but average doesn't necessarily have to mean bad.
Yeah.
It's just like I said, they didn't do anything, that I was like overly impressed by. So I would
Yeah.
personally give them a C.
Me too. I'd give them a C. This is basically the equivalent of, if you're in school, right, and you take a test, but you didn't study for that thing, but you kind of just gave it, the best of your ability and your knowledge, but at the same time you didn't really try. That's kind of the vibe that I'm getting. So like, around that C range. Borderline C minus because they didn't really do much to the point where it's like, all right, well, I can see, the vision here, but I do understand and I can't fault them for, trying to run it back after having such a successful season. So like I said, I foresee them taking a step back, and that's due to the fact that they didn't really do anything crazy with their offseason. I probably would have wanted to see them upgrade from Harrison Barnes, but that didn't happen because I think at this point we all know Kyle Kuzma is probably better than Harrison Barnes, so I think they missed out on that for sure. And then looking at the roster, like I said, it's a solid roster, it's a competitive roster, but I think there's just so much better in the West that they didn't really do as much as the other teams that we've talked about yet, and they could still do more. The door is wide open for trades, like you said, to bring in that third piece that I think they're really missing to get them um, in a solid seat, for contention. But as of right now, I mean, it's rough because, like you said, they didn't fix any of their major problems, which was defense and things of that nature. So, defensively, they still look mediocre. But I think one of the bright spots in their not even really roster, but organization is definitely the coaching, and then obviously for the roster. It's definitely their stars, in De'Aaron Fox and then Domantas Sabonis. And I really, really think that they're trying to bank on Keegan Murray being that third star. So I think they're trying to get that homegrown star going. And I think that's the best thing that you can do for a small market team like that because it doesn't attract a lot of free agents. And, who knows what's out there for the trade market. We won't know really closer to the deadline. So I'm curious to see where it goes, but definitely a C for me.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, kind of average. You could bump it up to a C plus, maybe. Just because they did add Chris Duarte, but again,
That's still not
um,
enough. I don't know. I
yeah,
just think it's either got to be C or C minus, but
yeah,
that's just me.
yeah. I think, yeah, like you said, I think, like I said, a C is
Yeah.
probably fine because again, there were teams that had worse off seasons, I guess, but
Yeah, and
also
we'll
there were
get to
teams that had
those.
better. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of where I'm at with the Kings right now because, like I said, they are. I think they'll still be a good team. I don't think they'll win as many games as they did last year.
Nope.
Like you said, just because a number of these other teams got better. Um, but either way, they'll still, I think, especially in the regular season, they're gonna win. A decent amount of regular season games. Because again, the offense alone can carry you through the regular season. Not as much in the playoffs, but as long as they're healthy. Because again, like, I even mentioned the aspect of most of the guys on the roster played 70 plus games, which I think that actually I think set a record, or at least or close to a record, for the most amount of games played by guys, over the course of a season in a
Right.
while.
Yeah.
Um, so the likelihood of it happening again, not that high, but either way, regardless, we saw them, kind of be able to, the few times that some of those guys were out, they were able to survive a little bit, just because they still had enough offense, like I said, to carry them over the top, in the regular season. But regardless, again, like it was a great story. Last year, I like I said, I think they'll still be around as a competitive team. Um, I think that they could. and again, I think that they could win a playoff series. It just kind of depends, like I said, who they play against. Um, and just how do some of those guys on the roster pan out?
Yeah,
In my because
that's
you just never know, right?
it's
Because
up in the
sometimes,
air.
yeah, because a couple of these guys, it's possible that they have a season where they take a little bit of a step back. It's possible, right? Keegan Murray could have a season, where he's not quite as efficient or not quite as whatever going into the
Right.
second season. I'm not saying that's going to happen. But you just never know. Like I said, because they didn't make any major moves, a lot of it's just going to come down to the core guys and whether or not any of them got better.
Yeah, simple as that.
Yeah. So now we're gonna get into, to close this out, we're gonna get into more of the news and rumors around the league. Obviously, if you hadn't heard by this point, right, Jalen Brown, he's now officially, signed his new 5-year, $304 million extension, right? So at this point, the
It's
richest in
crazy.
NBA history, or highest in NBA history, I
Yeah.
guess. Um, again, like the way that I look at it is that, if you're Boston, you have to do it because you can't afford to lose Jalen Brown for nothing, right? He is a guy that, you even mentioned it at different points, even though Jason Tatum's the best player on the team,
Hmm.
there were multiple times in the playoffs, where sometimes he was their best guy.
Absolutely.
Again, like I said, I think Jason Tatum is definitely the better player, but there were times where, like, even if you go back to their finals appearance, right, there were some games where Brown was their best player. Um,
Right.
and again, like, you need a guy like that on your team. Like I said, you can't afford to lose him. But it is kind of interesting, just, the conversation, around him, just because I feel like, now there are people, who are, and again, I understand, the stuff about, his ball handling and passing woes, but he's still a really good player. I don't think all of a sudden he's just a guy, and again, like I said, I understand some of the flaws, but, he's still young. He should, in theory, still be able to get better. Um, again, he's going to be paid close to 70 million at the end of the contract. Um, but regardless, that's the deal with a lot of these supermax, contracts and these extensions is, you're paying to keep the guy, right? Because if you're Boston, are you better, if you bring back Jalen Brown than if you don't? I mean, yeah, you are better if you bring back Jalen Brown.
Right.
Um, I remember on Zach Lowe's podcast, he mentioned that there were executives, who were talking to him and they were like, I can't believe, that they paid that much, for their third or fourth best player. And I'm just like, is Jalen Brown their third, fourth best player? I would say no. I think
No,
he's their
he's their
second
second,
best player.
arguably first. It depends on the
Yeah. So,
situation. Depends on the night.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, and again, with Boston, they've been, one of the more competitive teams, pretty much every year. They've made deep playoff runs. They made it to an NBA finals. Um, so, I mean, it is going to be interesting, once they re-sign Tatum, to an extension, then you're basically paying super max money to two guys, and that's pretty much your roster for the most part because you're not gonna have much flexibility. I think they did give Porzingis that 2-year extension, which is whatever. We'll see
Right.
what comes of that, but regardless, Boston is kind of at this point, now where there's not going to be a whole lot of wiggle room for their roster. But I guess, before I, kind of close that out, you can kind of get into your thoughts as well,
Yeah.
on the contract.
Well, it's like for me, it doesn't surprise me. This was rumored for a long time. We already knew who's eligible for all this money. I think the number that probably surprises me the most is that 2028, 2029 year, deal. That's the one where it's like almost $70 million,
Yeah.
which is a lot of money. But that's also
Yeah.
economics because I think, we have to acknowledge that at one point Michael Conley was like that was one of the
Yeah.
biggest deals of all time. So it's like,
Yeah.
with time the money gets, larger and larger and the players get paid more and more. And this is what
Yeah.
happens when players are eligible for these supermax contracts. The more
Beal,
money
I think,
comes out.
had it last year.
Yeah, Beal had it last year. So it's like, this happens and it's just whenever it's time for these guys contracts to you know, uh, be renewed or extended or whatever, they the money is going to be there. So this shouldn't come to as like a surprise to anybody, and people shouldn't be angry about it at all because we're just going to see the number go up, in a couple of years or whoever is eligible next will probably get around the same, if not more. So,
Yeah. Tatum
and
will
kudos
probably
to
get
him.
more.
Exactly. And kudos to them for getting this done. We were on the kind of on the edge of our seats, like, well, where is this
Yeah.
deal? We were waiting for this for a long time because we were planning on
Yeah.
talking about it, as soon as it happened. But, we're thankful that it finally happened and he got his bag. So shout out to him. But holy cow, that's a lot of money if you really put it into perspective. Not
Yeah,
as
I
much as
guess
other sports, because we do, like, Mbappe, I think he
yeah,
was offered like almost like what, 770 something million?
yeah.
Like that's a
And then I
lot of money.
and then I think the transfer amount was like 300 something, so it basically equates to over 1 billion.
Yeah, and that's some,
Yeah.
that's more than, some countries can even afford themselves. But,
Yeah.
he obviously rejected the deal. But anyways, it's not a soccer podcast, it's a basketball podcast. But that just shows you,
Yeah.
there's a lot of money out there for these athletes. So, it's
Yeah.
all a big pool, and I'm just glad that Jalen Brown got his.
Yeah. I guess, to kind of like, add some intrigue,
Mhm.
do you think he finishes this contract with the Celtics?
That's a good question because I know there was a lot of rumblings that like,
Yeah.
the
'Cause
relationship
every
was
year
souring and like, the
yeah.
trade requests and then, it seems like Brad Stevens has to come in there and like, they have to have a conversation and then they iron it out. But, there is
Right.
some friction with him and the Boston fans, but I don't think it's to the point where they're going to push him out or he's going to want to leave, because I think, as long as he's on that squad with Tatum and, the other guys that are on that squad as well, I think they have a really good shot at coming out of the East, at times. There's
Yeah.
sometimes where they look better than Milwaukee, but then there's sometimes they look worse than Philly. So, it just depends on like I guess how well they play. I think, maybe if it's like 2 years down the line and they're still not winning and the roster is still the same, then I it wouldn't surprise me if he's traded, but then it's like, okay, well, who's going to want to actually pay him that money outside of,
Right.
the franchise that drafted him and pretty much
Yeah.
grew his talent?
Right. And we'll get more into Boston, once we get to them,
Yes. That's going to
down
be
the
an
road. But
intriguing team.
yeah, but obviously, this, had just come out today.
Right.
Well, Sunday, but if you're watching this on Monday, but still, regardless, yeah, this is basically brand new stuff.
Yes.
So just kind of an interesting thing, because again, the cap's gonna keep going up, presumably, and like you said, we're gonna hear, some crazy contracts. At some point, years down the road, there might be a guy that signs like a $500 million,
Don't be
extension. Not
surprised.
right now, but down the road,
It's
because
happened in
even
football.
yeah, because at one it's funny because if you go way, way back in the day, like what 40-ish years ago, right? You had guys, that basically were barely making $1 million.
Right.
I think Magic Johnson, I think when he signed his initial contract, it was like 25 years, $25 million or something. So basically like 1 million a year.
Right.
And that
And
was in,
that's
what,
that's
late
crazy.
early 80s.
Yeah,
So
that's
I
crazy,
mean,
man.
yeah, exactly.
But that's a
Now
part
a
of the
guy,
economy, it just moves
yeah,
up.
yeah, now a guy could make $25 million for half a season to play. So
Right.
just kind of interesting. Um, next up, according to execs, some of them think that contract talks are now easier with the new CBA because some of these veterans now know, okay, I'm only going to be making the minimum, if I'm going to sign with you. It's been mentioned with some of these teams like the Suns. What do you think about that? Do you
Hmm.
do you believe that in terms of what the executives, some of them have said, that the contract talks are easier?
Well,
Obviously we know the Suns, right? That's most of their roster aside from their max guys. But what do you think about that?
I think that's a good point because I mean, it's more leverage. So, I can't really argue with that. I think, and especially if executives are saying that, then I kind of have to take their word for it. And it seems like, a lot of deals are getting done swiftly. There's some guys that just aren't going to get the money, simple as that, whether it be due to, locker room stuff or anything like that. Christian Wood, but like, in general, like overall, it seems like a lot of these signings happen pretty quickly. A lot of the big names were kind of out of the way. Um, and I think, that's probably has something to do with the CBA. I think it makes it easier for some sides and a little bit harder for others. But, from the executive's point of view, I get that 100%.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of just how you have to look at it. Like you said, this free agency, even though it feels like not a whole lot has happened. Obviously, a lot of that is because everything happened within basically the first, couple of days. Because if you go back, a few seasons ago, like I think the 2019 offseason, right? That was the one with, like Kawhi going to the Clippers, Durant going to Brooklyn. Some of those guys, their decision took like, several days, right? I think Kawhi it took him basically like almost a week, if not a week to decide, right? Whereas with this free agency, everybody basically was off the table after like
Pretty
just a couple
much.
days. So
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because when we did that free agency stream, it was kind of interesting just how quickly a lot of that went because most of what we were hoping for to happen happened within day one. Because
Right.
again, all the contracts, like the Draymond one, the Van Vliet one, a lot of the other ones, they were done. Like I said, basically within 24 hours of that initial date, right? Like so, um, again, it'll be interesting to see if that continues to be the case. It's just again, it seems like it'll be interesting to see how the new CBA continues to develop because again, like we just started learning about it, and this is going to be the first year of it, basically. So right now, nobody's really in a bad spot just yet, right? But as we get deeper into it, right, then that's when you start losing draft picks. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, then you can't sign buyout guys. So after a couple seasons, we'll know what people think.
Right.
But for now, I think everybody's in a pretty good spot. Because clearly there were a few teams that clearly didn't mind going in deep into that tax, right? Like the Suns, right? He clearly the Matt Ishbia doesn't care.
Yeah,
Um,
pretty much.
you know, yeah, exactly. Yeah, clearly he doesn't care. He doesn't mind spending however much money he wants to spend. He's
They want to
basically
win.
putting all the cards on the table. Um, next up, according to ESPN, Ben Simmons nearing return, and they believe that he is ready to go back to being the guy that he was kind of prior to the injury. I guess the first question is, do you believe this?
I do. Um,
Okay,
I think enough time has gone by to the point where, I don't think any of this is BS anymore. I think this
okay,
is going to be, hopefully his second chance at having a great NBA career. We all know he was really fun to watch, regardless of the memes of him not shooting. Without his shot, he was putting up numbers that you can't argue against. And he was one of the better players in the league for sure. So, now I'm hoping, he's got his confidence back. No more injuries, none of the BS. And it seems like, some of his teammates even, have some confidence in him. I want to see the coaching staff have some confidence in him. That'll make me, 100% be like, okay, they've got his back. But this is good news to me. And I don't think it's BS.
yeah. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I still have some stock left in Ben Simmons.
Me
Like
too.
you said, he was a fun player to watch in Philly. Sometimes incredibly frustrating, because of the inability to shoot. Um, but it just seems so strange because it's just hard for me to believe that he just kind of went from a guy who was kind of like in that tier of a top 20, 25, whatever player, to now all of a sudden like he's barely playing at all. By the time before his injuries, put him out with that back surgery or whatever. Right, he was coming off the bench playing a very minimal role. I just would have a really hard time believing that that guy is just who he's going to be. From this point on,
Right.
maybe that is the case. We'll see. But I am willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. That hopefully with those back injuries because back injuries are a serious thing. They're no joke. I've never had one, right?
But we know the
Fingers
history on it.
crossed. But yeah, but we know the history on it. It's not easy. It's tough. At any age. So hopefully he's able to come back and bounce back.
I think he will.
Um, and that's what everybody would want. Because again, for Simmons, if he can come back and show that he can still play and contribute at a high level, he'll get another contract. Whether or not it's Brooklyn or elsewhere. Um, and other teams will be okay, with having him despite, whatever headaches he may bring, or anything else for that matter, right? That's kind of
Right.
what you open. Then if you're Brooklyn, if you get a really good version of Ben Simmons, that makes your roster, more versatile and more competitive, right? Because,
Exactly.
we don't really look at Brooklyn, as like a, crazy, awesome, competitive team going into next year, right? Like,
They'll
so,
be all
but
right.
yeah, but if you get a really good version of Ben Simmons, right, that's going to lift your ceiling, at least
Alongside
somewhat, right?
Bridges, oh my gosh, imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. Because then that gives you a lot of length, a lot of athleticism, versatility, switching. It's just again, can Simmons and Claxton play together? You know, I don't know, but you do have Bridges and Cam Johnson who can shoot well. Um, but either way, for Brooklyn, they're trying to be a competitive roster because similar to Houston, their pick situation is kind of, a little bit, different. So, they have to compete, right? They can't be a team that can just afford to be bad. Even though they are in the midst of, I guess, a semi quasi rebuild.
Yeah.
But still, they're trying to be competitive. And if Simmons can come back, and he's still got something in the tank, and he should. He's like, what, 25, 26, or I don't know, however old he is. He's not old at all. So he should
Right.
be at an age where, I guess if I, check basically, I mean, yeah, so he's 27. Okay, so he's a little older than I thought, just recently turned 27, but still,
Still,
that's an age.
that's young.
Yeah, that's still young. You're basically just barely entering your prime. So, hopefully he can get back to what he was. I did not realize he had that many nicknames. Simo the Savage,
Never
Young
heard it.
Socialite,
Never
Fresh
heard it.
Prince, that one,
Yeah.
Peacemaker, Benny the Yank,
Okay.
Big Ben, and the Wizard of
I've
Oz.
heard of Big Ben, but I haven't heard of any of the others except for the Fresh Prince one. But good lord, that's a lot.
Interesting. Yeah, so hopefully the Big Yank can come back, um,
Yeah.
and have a bounce back season.
Yeah, I'm rooting for him
Again,
100%.
yeah, exactly. Maybe again, or maybe he'll click his heels and have a bounce back season next year.
Yeah.
We'll see. Like again, like you said, hopefully he can come back because he was a really good player, and it's just kind of surprising to see him go from a complete, a guy that was a star to a complete
He'll
non-factor.
be back.
Yeah. Um. Next up, according to Tim McMahon of ESPN, Dylan Brooks. Again, we kind of know, right? Basically, the issue for him in Memphis was he wanted more touches. He didn't really want to be, the fourth or fifth option. He wanted more. He wanted more of a role in the offense. And again, he is a guy, that does take a lot of shots. Not always great ones. He does have value as a defensive player, as a versatile, rugged, physical defender. But it's going to be interesting to see, what that looks like in Houston, because, in Houston, that may be harder to get away with only because he's on, a bigger contract now. But, at the same time with Ime Udoka, right, he's a guy, that, he would get on everybody in Boston, so, I mean, there's potential, if he tries to, do some of that similar stuff in Houston, right? I mean, Udoka might kind of yank him over, to the side and, kind of, say, what are you doing?
Yeah, we could see like Cam Whitmore take his place pretty much. But, in terms of like Dylan Brooks, that doesn't surprise me. That's kind of the narrative that we've heard on him. And I think, you can kind of see that if you just watch NBA basketball yourself. If you've seen a Memphis Grizzlies game when they were all healthy and Brooks was on the floor, great energy on defense, sometimes a little obnoxious, but on offense, it could be either hot or cold. And when it's cold, it's horrendous. And I'm not going to say, he's the reason they lose some of their game or lost some of their games, but he has potential to take you out of the game, shoot his way
Yeah.
out of the game. So, it is what it is. That's kind of just who he is. So that doesn't surprise me as to
Yeah,
why,
exactly.
he was out of there.
Yeah, exactly. For every game he might shoot you into a game, he'll have a few where he shoots you out of it. But that's just kind of who he is as an offense player. Again, there's no question that he's an awesome defensive player. But can he kind of simmer down on the offensive end? Like I said, I don't know because again, with that big contract, I would imagine he's gonna, you know, say like, "Hey, I'm getting paid 20 something million dollars a year, so I'm not gonna just be a guy that just sits in the corner on offense."
We'll
Um,
see where it goes. It's
we'll
going to be
see where it
interesting
goes.
to see those personalities clash.
Yeah, and again, like all those other teams, we'll get into Houston, as we get deeper into these teams. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about them as well.
Yeah.
Um, After that, according to Bradley Beal, right, he had his interviews and conferences and everything, and he mentioned he thought that the Suns traded him for Devin Booker. Do you believe that?
I think that was a joke, but at the same
Okay,
time, when when it was first announced that Beal was heading to the Suns, I did think we were getting Booker for half a second, but then I was like, snap back to reality, no shot. Booker's like, their franchise cornerstone right now. I think that's Booker's team even more so than Durant's, So I don't think, I don't think Booker was ever on the table. So I'm sure,
yeah, I think
Washington called and was like, Bradley Beal for Devin Booker. They're like, nope. And then, they
yeah,
just had to give him what they had. So,
right, yeah,
but I think that was more of a joke because
yeah, like you
Beal
said, I think
does have more of like a funny personality, especially
yeah,
if you know and watch clips of
yeah,
him and
I
stuff.
think he was
He's a
joking.
memeable guy, so I think he was joking.
Yeah, I think yeah, because he's the one that had like that face, after
Yeah,
one of those games. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
he
I mean,
literally
like
looked
I
like
said,
that.
yeah, yeah, I thought he was joking too. I just thought it was kind of a funny
Yeah,
statement.
sure.
Yeah, just because again, like you mentioned, I'm sure if you're a Wizards fan, that's probably what you would be hoping for.
Yeah, that's what I would have wanted. Beal for Booker. I'll take the swap, but it didn't happen. And yeah, I
Right.
think that's that just is what it is. I think he was just joking.
Yeah. And then finally, Clippers don't want to part with Terrence Mann. I mean, we kind of know this, I feel like, for the most part already. We know that the Clippers, if there was a way to trade for Harden without having to give up, any of their core pieces, it would have already been done. Kind of the same thing with the Lillard situation where, again, if Miami, if there was a way, to trade for Lillard without having to give up any of their real core pieces, it would have already been done. Um, I guess at a certain point, like, do you feel like either of these trades are going to happen? Like, do you still believe that they're going to happen, or are you like kind of at a point where it's like, what if we actually go into the season? What if both guys go into the season, on their current respective teams. And maybe it's just something that's either pushed down the line or something else like that. What do you think?
I think the Harden one will be pushed down the line, but I think the Miami one will, or the Lillard one will be, ironed out, and they'll get the
Okay.
details done, before the
Yeah.
season starts. But the Harden one, I don't think there's a shot because I don't think a lot of Clippers fans even really want Harden. But I don't know. I don't really know a lot of Clippers fans, but
Yeah. Well, again,
I don't know.
shout out to Xander Cade, right, who commented, on our last Laker video.
Yeah,
Um, he's a Clipper fan, and he mentioned, I believe, when those rumors first came out, he didn't really want Harden.
yeah. I think he
I
preferred
don't.
Russ over Harden, which was very
Yeah,
interesting.
and he might have both.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah, again, I don't know how indicative that is, of all Clippers fans, because in fairness, like you, I don't know a lot of Clipper fans, nor have I really talked to a lot of Clippers
Right.
fans. The only ones I've really talked to were when I went to Los Angeles, early or late last year, for that Lakers Denver game, but outside of that, I don't really know, a lot of Clipper fans personally. So,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
don't know
know,
any.
like I said, if that's, how most Clipper fans feel, but I can understand, the Clipper fans being kind of like, I don't know about Harden, just because again he's been in a lot of other situations, and it's not like the Philly situation he's in right now is even really that bad, right? It's not, the same quite the same as the Portland situation where there's no world where Portland is like a competitive roster, right? Like
Right.
Philly was a competitive team last year, even though we didn't believe that they were going to go to the finals and represent the East. But there was a world, for a minute, right, where they were up 3-2 on the Celtics.
Sure.
And after that, you never know what happens, right? But just I can understand the Harden thing where again he's asked out, multiple times. And again, given, some of the other factors, right? Just like, some of the things that he likes to do in his spare time, which again, I'm not trying to criticize somebody for that, right? But, just in comparison to like a Damian Lillard, right? I can see, why, some Clippers fans might not be too thrilled with it. But again, if you can pull it off and not have to give up core pieces, right, then I wouldn't have an issue with it at all, right? Because again, like we know, and again, spoiler alert, right? That's going to be our next team, basically. Because
Clippers
that's the
are on
last team left.
next.
Yeah, last in the Pacific Division, right? But I mean, like they have a number of guys on the roster that probably need to go. And those are the guys that the Clippers are probably looking to move. But again, if I'm Philly, right, I'm not trying to take James Harden for nothing, basically.
Yeah.
Like I want something back because he's still a good player.
Right.
So, yeah, like I said, I do feel like the Lillard trade is probably more likely than the Harden one. I'm not
Yep.
saying the Harden one won't happen. It's just I feel like there may be, even more hoops to jump over because it's just we haven't, the Clippers it seems like are the only team that wants Harden. I mean, I don't know if the Heat are the only team that want Lillard, but like,
They're the only ones
maybe
that
they
have come
are.
out of the woodworks, but others can.
Yeah, so I feel like some of it is just the other teams like Portland and the Clippers, just not the Clippers, Portland and Philly, kind of waiting, hoping that another team kind of just comes up, right? Because with the Donovan Mitchell thing last year, right? For a long time, it was thought that the Knicks were the team that was going to get him, and then all of a sudden Cleveland kind of comes in with this other offer, and then just kind of swoops in,
Yeah.
and just takes him, right? Because and they were rumored at one point like to be kind of interested, but they were never looked at as the potential favorites, right? It was like I think if I remember correctly, it was like Knicks, Cavs, I think Wizards, and then maybe I think Charlotte was the other one.
Yeah.
Um, but like it was never positioned as like Cavs are like in second place. You know what I mean? Like it,
Right.
it
I
was
know what you
always
mean.
like yeah, it was
Knicks are the
always
front
Knicks are
runners. Yep.
yeah, Knicks are the front runner, clear favorite, and then it never happened. So it's possible. It's just, we haven't heard anything about any other teams being right. I don't think there's the Knicks thing. I think at one point it was like, yeah, the Clippers and the Knicks are interested in Harden, but the Knicks one has just all but disappeared. Um, which again I think is the right move for the Knicks. I don't think you should trade for James Harden if you're New York. Um, because I just feel like there's a little bit of redundancy with him and Brunson.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't feel that way about the Clippers.
Right.
So, yep. Well, again, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes, right? Again, obviously, we talked about the Kings, and the other rumors going on around the NBA. And again, like we've always mentioned, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We appreciate the support, and the comments. And again, because like we mentioned with the Lakers, where again we did get a comment, leave a comment,
Yeah. Don't be
below.
shy.
Yeah, exactly. As to whether or not, you agree with our takes on the Sacramento Kings, right? Do you feel like they did a better job than we think? Or do you think that they may have done a worse job? We'll see. But let us know in the comments.
Yeah.
But either way, thanks for listening. Hopefully you have a great weekend, and we'll see you Monday.